Good morning. It is morning, right? My body clock's still a little bit here and there. So good morning, everyone. It is a genuine honor to be here, and thank you so much, Rosemary. Before I get started on anything, I do want to thank Chris, I want to thank Shelley, and I want to thank David for all of the work they put into getting me here and making all of this wonderful event happen. I'd also like to thank Osgrid and Louise over at the back for a really good event. So I've actually had the opportunity to meet some of you already and preview some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. Taking Ben's point, I'm not easily offended either, and I do much prefer to be challenged. So if there are questions at the end of this, do your worst. Okay? Right, so I'm going to talk about the UK experience, and I am going to canter through this at a fair pace. What I will say up front is there are references to all sorts of things that I'm going to talk about quickly, but you can read the full papers behind them afterwards at your leisure. So let me talk shamelessly a little bit about my interests. So first and foremost, I'm a researcher at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College, but I'm also a recovering energy regulator. So I used to work in Ofgem in the UK, where I was head of Sustainable Energy Futures, so the crystal ball gazer in residence. My interests are threefold. So I'm really interested in what is a future energy business model. I'm very interested in the role of energy policy and regulation in enabling the future to happen. And what I'm particularly interested in is the changing relationship of people, not consumers, but people and energy. A lot of that comes together in a big project that's going on in the UK called the Energy Revolution Research Consortium, and this is a real privilege for us academics to get involved in real-world practice. So it's a big program funded by government, about £200 million worth of projects going in, building smart energy systems of the future in real places in the UK. And we as academics get to work alongside that, study, learn from, emulate, evaluate. It's wonderful. So the UK is on a net zero journey. This is what it says in our Climate Change Act. And the basic target is to achieve at least 100% emission reduction by 2050. And the reason why we say at least is because if we go too slow and accumulate too much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, we may need to take it out. And that's why that target has at least. Now, here's a little bit of UK trivia, if you like, on energy. So what I thought I would do would put up where we're at now and where we're expected to be in 2050. And I just want to pull out a few things. So population will go up over that time. Energy per person, we have about 0.25 gigawatts per person, per gigawatt hours per person at the moment. No idea in the future because it depends on energy efficiency, energy services, all that kind of thing. We have 33% renewables in our system. That doesn't sound very much, but my goodness, the journey we've been on over the last decade. It was 5% 10 years ago. I'll show you the rate at which they're going in a second. We expect to have about 80% renewables by 2050. Vehicles per person, about one vehicle for every two people. In the future, that's going to go down a little, but that entire vehicle fleet is expected to go over to battery electric vehicles, not hybrids, battery electric, pure play. Electric heating in homes, 8%. We have 86% of homes connected to the gas grid in the UK. We have a wonderful gas grid, and we can't have that in the future. It is not compatible with net zero. So either that gas has to be decarbonised, or more likely, those homes going in behind people's front doors are going to have to change their heating system. And the scenarios show around 60% electric heating in the UK. So that's a big transition, right? Within that, there are also some very important things going on. So we have this net zero objective, but what we haven't thrashed out in the UK is what other objectives we're going to put in on top of that. So is it lowest cost transition or reasonable cost? Because that matters, the pathway you're going on. What does security of supply mean in a net zero energy system? What's the role of competition in delivering? Is it going to be worse or better for the environment? Is that a choice we make? What about equity, fairness, justice? How are we going to bake all of that into this? And when we actually went out and talked to citizens in the UK in a big survey by the UK Energy Research Centre, they said they're prepared to pay for this transition or pay their part of this transition, but they expect it to be better than today. What on earth does better mean? It means a completely different thing to different people, but it's really important. So that's going to have to be baked in somehow into the future. It's a complex system at the moment, so that horrendogram up in the corner there, I'll come back to, but that's the institutional arrangements in electricity right now, and actually the future is likely to be more complex than that. It's going to need certainty at some point, and I'll come on to that in the next slide, and it's going to have to be acceptable. So environment has never had a higher profile than it does at the moment in the UK. Extinction Rebellion, school strikes, Greta Thunberg, all of that kind of thing have pushed that up to one of the top issues in the recent election, and that was a Brexit election. But it was right up there. No party could not be committed to net zero in that election. So this is why certainty matters. So this is our advice from the Committee on Climate Change, so that's the independent advisors to government. What this is saying, and what it makes is a massive difference to the target we used to have. So we used to have an 80% decarbonisation target. We now have 100%. And the difference that means is it used to be a case of do this or that. And now it's do this and this and this faster, simultaneously, full tilt. So you've got to decarbonise electricity, at the same time explore hydrogen, at the same time improve energy efficiency in buildings and transfer them across to zero carbon heating, and sort out the entire of road transport, and decarbonise the heavy industry, and look into land use and afforestation, and sort out diet in the public. So veganism, vegetarianism, all of that. By the way, there's another whole slide of this, which I'm not going to do today. So that gives an impression, right? None of those are trivial, and they're all interdependent as well. So let me just put that in a slightly different context for the UK. So this is about the rate and the supply chain. So in order to hit the sort of targets we have, we need to be deploying around 3.6 gigawatts of renewables electricity every year for the next 30 years, 1.2 million battery electric vehicles, or 136 per hour every hour for the next 30 years, and 68 zero carbon heating installations every hour for the next 30 years. So I put this on Twitter, and I thought, wow, this is such a good stat, and I got completely schooled because I knew this one. We've been installing 4 gigawatts of renewables every year for the past decade in the UK, so we're already ahead of that curve. Actually, we replaced 331 vehicles an hour. The problem is they're all internal combustion engines, or the majority are. And we have the best boiler supply chain in the world, I think, but it replaces gas boilers with gas boilers. So it's not a pace issue, it's a supply chain issue. It's a standards issue. The other side of this, I'll make it sound like technology is the answer. It absolutely isn't. Because Committee on Climate Change, again, they've shown analysis that around 38% of the carbon savings are pure technology plays. So replace something with something, which means the rest of it has got something to do with behavior, either learning or changing modes, so changing mode of travel, changing mode of heating, changing mode of things, or pure social behavior, diet, flying, that kind of thing. So you cannot do this transition without people doing things differently and willingly. So I argue, and many of us do in the UK, that this is a massive opportunity for data-driven, more consumer-centric business models. The reason is because we think it's going to be a much more complex environment. So in a world, in a UK, where you have so much variable output renewable electricity, it makes no sense for supply to follow demand. It makes much more sense for demand to follow available supply, because that is when energy is going to be cheapest, as long as you can get it from A to B. Anyone wants to talk to me about this? This is my half-hourly tariff and my battery in my home, and I'd happily geek out about all of the wonderful arbitrage that's going on in my house. It does mean there's going to be lots of new kits, so replacing heating system, new vehicles, all of that wonderful other connected devices that are coming along, but they come with upfront costs. A boiler in the UK, a gas boiler, costs about £1,500. A heat pump, £6,000 minimum. at the moment because the supply chain isn't there. So who's going to help consumers through dynamic pricing, through the installation and operation of that new kit, and through those upfront costs, which means that some people will not be able to afford? It's also a massive opportunity for business. So I'm not going to delve into this at all, but we've done some research together with Leeds University that looked into what scenarios mean as a value opportunity. So a new pool of untapped value that businesses could get involved in. So let's say an electricity retailer. We think there's about £21 billion of new value available to a retailer. For example, putting electricity and putting services around electric vehicles would be one example of a value pool in that. And that in context is something like 30 to 50% of the whole UK retail market in new value. And that doesn't include heat, by the way. So the value's there, but what we think it means is rather than the traditional retailer model where they're really just dealing with price risk and hedging and all of that thing to deliver a commodity at a set price, in the future, you're asking a company to potentially take on financial risk, so upfront costs, maybe at no upfront cost to consumers, the price risk in a dynamic pricing environment, and potentially service risk if they're delivering energy as a service or mobility as a service as opposed to selling a commodity. Or you might even have a situation where consumers want to take on the full fat risk in that future, peer-to-peer energy, etc. So completely exposed. But the question is, if you're a regulator and consumers take on that risk themselves, what happens if it goes badly wrong? How are they going to be protected in that future just because, maybe didn't quite understand what they were getting into, etc. So there's lots of thinking about new business models in the UK. Here's a paper I wrote. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but let's just say a retailer in the future could make money by selling kits and more commodity. So quite a traditional model, but increasing the amount of electricity they sell, or selling as a service. So I sell you heat, I keep you comfortable, I guarantee a price per month, and we enter into a service level agreement so you don't open your windows in winter. Peer-to-peer, a platform to help you interact directly with the market, for example, take away some of the complexity. Or perhaps Google or Amazon rock up and say, I'll give you 200 quid. If you give me 200 quid a month, I'll give you an absolutely awesome life. And everything's in there, entertainment, broadband, energy, all the services you need, and you've got literally no idea where energy fits into that, what the cost of anything is, but it's great. That kind of model, okay? We did a little bit of consumer research. So we asked 2,000 bill payers in the UK whether they would be interested in any of those new models. So over on your left, you've got the kind of like traditional retailer type models. Over on the right, you've got the new ones. So peer-to-peer, energy service company, third-party control. What an awful name. I should never have called it that. That's the lifestyle as a service. What we found was there was about 50% of consumers would go for one of the new models, okay? The model that was most popular was peer-to-peer energy, and we thought, why is that? It was not particularly any of our favorites, so I'm not even sure we wrote it up very nicely in the materials. The reason why consumers went for that is it turns out there's a really large segment of UK consumers who don't trust anyone, barely the police. So this gave no middle person, and therefore they went with it. It was just a direct contract with the market. So that's an interesting segment. Now, I'm making it out that there's going to be all this wonderful innovation in the UK market. Actually, things are moving rather slowly. I did some research with Exeter University, looking at what sort of innovation is going in traditional retailer, supplier we call them, but retailer models in electricity. And there is some good news there. There's lots of companies exploring energy as a service or bundling products together or looking at EVs, for example, or doing some consumer segmentation. However, underlying all of that is exactly the same commodity model. So the more they sell, the more money they make. And that's in a market where demand is going down at the moment. So everyone's competing for fewer kilowatt hours. Now, why is that? Back to the horrendogram. I did promise I'd come back. So this is by Exeter University, a wonderful lady called Bridget Woodman, Dr. Bridget Woodman, and it shows the institutional relationships in the electricity sector. And it's all of the institutions, the finance, the movement, the codes, all of that kind of stuff. I simplify it, because I'm quite simple at heart, on the right. And if you imagine, let's say, a beetle is peer-to-peer, and an owl is an energy service company, and perhaps the crab is lifestyle as a service. By the time you've come through that regulatory spaghetti, you all end up coming out the other end as the same thing, because it's the only thing you can be. You're told how to build, you're told how to pick up the phone, you're told how to do everything else. There's only one model you can be. And one of my colleagues cruelly described it as it's just a bill with a different sticker on it. And that's it. So, so there you go. We're all dogs in this world. So there is also a question in all of this. If you can have way more complexity, who on earth is going to be in charge of the system? So there's a massive bun fight going on in the UK at the moment about who's going to run this complex system. So there's the electricity system operator, National Grid, is saying, I can be the conductor. I want to reach down into distribution networks and control stuff, and actually reduce the role of a distribution network operator. Or the distribution network operators in this orchestra are saying, well, hang on a minute, I could be the brass section, they could be the woodwind section, and we can run our own thing, we can optimize, we can do beautiful music as long as we know what everyone else is doing, and we can be our own conductors. And at the same time, you've got a lot of movement with so many connected devices in the system that says, well, actually, why not let the instruments play themselves? There's enough intelligence in those instruments, and if those instruments can play themselves, and if artificial intelligence moves along, why don't they make up their own music as well? So this is a big debate at the moment in the UK. What's actually likely to happen is some strange combination of all of that simultaneously. So I've had lots of conversations about this over here. It's fascinating. Those things at the bottom become increasingly important. Good data across the system, clear rules, what music are we playing, what tempo, the roles, who's doing what and who's responsible for what, and transparency. Does everyone is able to see what's happening in the system? So I'm going to finish, I think, on the next slide after this one. These are two reports I wrote with one of the most wonderful human beings in the world, Laura Sands, and some of my colleagues at Imperial, who are also wonderful, Professor Richard Green and Dr. Aidan Rhodes. And it's very easy to read reports about what regulation could be in the future. And we boiled it down to 6 pretty simple things. I'll leave you to read the reports, but let me just whistle through these very quickly. Firstly, electricity retailers don't act like normal retailers. A normal retailer is a supermarket, and it exerts immense supply chain pressure to drive the right products and the right services for its consumers. So it might not be very nice to milk and dairy farmers, but it's very, very good to its consumers, getting the right price, getting the right product quality, all of that kind of thing. We think electricity retailers need to start acting more like other retailers. They need to be normalized against other retailers, which means we probably need to move away from regulating process, prescriptive regulation, how you bill, how you pick up the phone, to risk-based regulation, where a company comes to the regulator and says, I am going to do these activities, and you are risk assessed against the harm they could cause to the system. And you might even pay an insurance premium in order to cover the harm that could be caused. If you're going to have more bundling, you might need to bring together consumer protection into a single regulator, because it might not make sense if there's no divisibility between services. At the same time, is economic regulation, does it need to be in separate sectors or not? Or are there benefits to bringing that together as well? We're a little bit open on that one. If you're going to open up to this myriad of interesting business models, then you probably need to have a couple of things going on. So firstly, if you're going to leave all of that freedom to how models go, then the regulator needs to have a commensurately large hammer to bring down on bad behavior. So it's not about fining companies, it's potentially about putting CEOs in jail. Secondly, the regulator probably has to be better at data than any of the companies in that, because it cannot be in the center pulling levers. It has to be at the perimeter looking in and spotting trends and spotting things that might result in harm. Therefore, data becomes such an important issue, and there's been a recent energy data task force in the UK, and one of its key recommendations is that energy data is considered and should be considered a public good and therefore open. Now, this is going to cause all sorts of fights in the UK, but it's incredibly important, and I should say that Laura Sands chaired that task force as well. And then finally, what does security of supply and security of system mean in this interesting, different future? Some consumers are going to be able to satisfy 80% of their own security. Some are going to be in completely different situations. The system At the moment in the UK, we build stuff. That's what security means. We build more stuff like generation. But it needs to be in the future. If you want to try and minimize the size of the system you're building, then security has to mean try not to build anything new, manage with the demand side, manage with flexibility, and so forth. So it becomes a very different world. So at that point, I'm going to stop talking. I think you've heard enough from me this morning already, and I'd love to hear some questions from you. So thank you very much.